God met me in Jerusalem in December 1995. See, at that time, I had served on the faculty of Singapore Bible College for 4 years, and I started teaching some of the courses for the fourth time. And, teaching something over and over can oftentimes lose its challenge. But the chance came for me to lead a trip to Israel. And so I jumped at that opportunity. I'd never been to Israel before. And 25 daring souls followed me to Israel, as with me being their leader, leading them to a place I'd never been to before. But, well, of course, I had studied about it, but I'd actually never been there. And the height of the trip for me, though, was actually not something that I saw there in Israel, but it was what happened to me right outside Temple Mount at an antiquities store. I was there looking at these various artifacts, and different people from my tour group were talking with the vendors there, and two of them ended up arguing. A vendor, an Arab vendor, started arguing with one of my tour people about the price of some artifact. I think it was a Herodian lamp. And my tour friend and my group said, "You want to charge me $20? I saw that for $18 down the street, And they were getting higher and higher in their voices, and honestly, I felt quite embarrassed. And looked at my watch, and we have 20 minutes until the tour bus comes and picks us up. So what am I going to do with my 20 minutes? Certainly don't want to be in this shop. So I walked out and I sat down on the ground outside. And I looked up and I said, "God, what do you want to do with me here? What am I? It was actually, I felt like God was actually saying to me, Rick, what are you doing? What are you doing?" And it sort of reminded me of Elijah going down to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. And God saying, "What are you doing, Elijah?" And Elijah gave his speech. So I gave my speech. "Lord, I'm teaching your people your word in your land." And God didn't speak to me in an audible voice, but I sensed that he was saying to my spirit, "No, you're not. You're getting rich people to pay for your trip to Israel because you couldn't afford to go to Israel yourself." Really? And then it dawned on me that here I was in Jerusalem, and that Jesus spent very little time in Jerusalem. I mean, think about it. Jesus' ministry was pretty much up in Galilee, up in the north, not among the wealthy people, and frankly, his disciples as a whole were really not wealthy men. Matthew was, but he gave away his wealth. Jesus changed the world through people who were not the so-called rich and influential. I normally put those two together, rich and influential. Jesus changed the world through the poor and influential. And then I thought about the students I had up to that point that had come to Singapore. The ones from the poorer countries, frankly, were the ones that were going out and reaching more people with the gospel. Now, I'm not anti-rich, but I am pro-poor. God is. God was telling me, maybe you need to change your priorities, Rick. Maybe instead of bringing rich people to Jerusalem to pay for your trip, maybe you should go to Mongolia. Mongolia. It was so clear from the Lord. Go to Mongolia. And I said, "Lord, it's cold up there. Out of Mongolia. I mean, I'm a tropical missionary. My blood is thin. I live on the equator. Surely you don't want me to go to Mongolia." And God said, "Trust me. Trust me. Change your priorities. Change them so that you will invest yourself in people who truly are influential. Because it is not true that the rich are therefore the influential. That changed my life, sitting on that brick step there in Jerusalem. It changed me from being a man who would be surrounding myself with wealthy people to intentionally going out to others who wouldn't have the opportunities to maybe go to Israel. And so it began a whole new pattern of life for me that has lasted, well, actually to this very second. Because this whole series is being recorded on my 62nd trip to countries that are not as financially benefited as a place like Singapore, which now is the most expensive city in the world to live in. And I found that even though it's so expensive there, the Lord has helped me to live cheaply through various means, living on campus and faculty apartment. The Lord has certainly provided our means. And He's provided the means to go and try to help in areas that do not have financial resources that Singapore have. I found this several times in my life, and perhaps you can understand in your own life, you can see it in your own life. The more money you have, the more insulated you become from others, especially those who have less money. Do you see it happening in your own life? I was beginning to see that happen in my life in my 4th year there as a missionary in Singapore. And God has helped me with it. I certainly have not conquered this. But it is something to think about. To what extent has your money insulated you? Some of us have a lot more money than we need. Some of us really live day to day. But how much do you devote yourself to your possessions? Do you own things, or do things own you? Do you have more friends with less money than you? Or than you did 5 years ago? What goals do you have in your life in terms of how you use your money to help the poor? Do you believe God wants you to be generous to the poor? I suspect if any of us really thought about that very long at all, we'd say, well, of course God wants us to be generous with the poor. But why? Here's the question we're going to address as we look at our next book. Why? Why does God want you to be generous to the poor? I don't think I have to elaborate that He really does. I think most of us will recognize that God loves the poor. And He's generous with them. But why does He want us to be generous with them? To understand this, we have to look at the background in the minor prophets that we have been studying recently. We could say that these are minor prophets with a major message. And our study up to this session has finally brought us to Micah. Micah of Moresheth. At this time, the kingdom was split. The kingdom split in 1 Kings, and it would soon leave Judah as the surviving kingdom because that kingdom that split was about to see the northern nation end. And Micah lived at that time when the nation just to the north of him was actually going to end. If you can imagine yourself, the nation just north of where you live is about to be destroyed and people sent into exile. Do you think that would have an impact in your life? Do you think you'd notice? Do you think God would work through that? That's exactly where Micah was at. The Assyrians were the rising threat of the day. From Nineveh, they began conquering nations just in about every direction. They were making their way in the Assyrian expansion, especially westward toward Israel, toward Judah. And they had conquered Aram, and during Micah's lifetime, they conquered Israel to his north, whereas Micah lived there in Judah. They were a ruthless nation. Nobody was able to stand against them. Even countries binding together to fight against the mighty Assyrians failed utterly. And we see that during this time, Isaiah was actually a contemporary to Micah. Isaiah, Micah, Hosea, actually all of them lived during this time of the fall of the northern kingdom under Pekah and Hoshea, the last of the Israelite kings. If you want a memory device that will help you remember who was ministering during that time, think of him. I mentioned this last time. Kim will tell you that Hosea and Isaiah and Micah were actually contemporaries. Not too shocking to think that these men knew each other and were friends, because they certainly were speaking for the Lord at the same time in the same areas, although Hosea was up farther up in the northern kingdom. And we will see, though, when we look at Micah's messages at this time, we're going to see reasons why we should be generous. He has 3 sermons that he's put together all in one prophecy. Each sermon begins with the word listen. And today we'll have an overview of the whole book of Micah, where we'll see 3 reasons to be generous. And I hope that God will stir within you a heart of generosity toward the poor as a result of seeing what the Lord did in Micah's life and how God enabled Micah to be able to recognize that God wanted him to be generous, and he wanted to be God's means to help the people to be generous to the poor. So keep in mind, be generous. That's the title of this session. And what that means is don't ask what's in it for you, ask what's in it for them. In essence, Micah says 3 times to have a heart for the poor. But there's also benefits for us, too, when we actually have a heart for the poor. So let's get in the book, looking especially right now at the first chapter, where we see that the first sermon, where Micah says, listen, to start it, he says, God will reward your generosity. God will reward generosity. That is certainly not a discouragement for us being generous, is it? God knows that when we are generous to other people, wow, we're going to be the ones that benefit as well as those to whom we give. We see actually in the structure of Micah, Dr. Homer Heater at Dallas Seminary during the time I was there was very effective in sharing this structure. I'll share it with you, where it alternates between judgment and hope in 3 major cycles. We see in the first 7 verses here where there is a judgment section in the beginning of Micah. Attention, let all the people of the world listen. Let the earth and everything in it hear. The sovereign Lord is making accusations against you. The Lord speaks from his holy temple. What God was saying is, judgment is coming. Micah was from Moresheth Gath, just about a little bit southwest of Jerusalem, there in Judah. And yet God called him to preach to the nation north of him, to Samaria. And he says that the judgment is going to come to Samaria. He says, I will make Samaria a heap of rubble, verse 6. A place for planting vineyards. I will pour her stones into the valley and lay bare her foundations. God's going to come and judge these people in the north who have lived in prosperity but have oppressed the poor. He also has a message for the southern nation as well. Micah is quite unique among the prophets because he preaches to both the north and the south. And he says in verse 16, "O people of Judah, shave your heads in sorrow, for the children you love will be snatched away. Make yourselves as bald as a vulture, for your little ones will be exiled to distant lands." So he's speaking both directions. He's speaking to the north, he's speaking to the south. He says in verse 5 that God is going to melt the world before him. And all this is because of Jacob's transgression, because of the sins of the house of Israel. And what is Jacob's transgression? Is it not Samaria? So here's referring to the northern kingdom. And what is Judah's high place? Is it not Jerusalem? Jerusalem is referred to as a high place. Normally think of high places as places of idolatry, right? Exactly. Micah's lament is that Jerusalem has become a place of idolatry, just like a high place. And so he identifies with the people, and he says, "Therefore I will mourn and lament," in verse 8. "I will walk around barefoot and naked. I will howl like a jackal and moan like an owl." Why would he be moaning like that? Because of this particular sin of his people. It's the sin of exploitation. Our key word for Micah is exploitation. It's a similar key word that we had for one other book. Can you recall which book? It was the book of Amos. Amos said the people were guilty of injustice. Micah says they're guilty of exploitation, which is really a form of injustice because the rich have the power to oppress the poor. And so they exploit them. And so we see Micah lamenting about that judgment. God makes the pronouncement, Micah laments. God makes another pronouncement as we get into chapter 2, the first 5 verses, about those who live in poverty. "What sorrow awaits you who lie awake at night, thinking of evil plans. You rise at dawn and hurry to carry them out simply because you have the power to do so. When you want a piece of land, you find a way to seize it. When you want someone's house, you take it by fraud and violence. You cheat a man of his property, stealing his family's inheritance." What a sad thing for Micah to see that happen. And so he laments to God of what's happening. It could be quite despairing unless the Lord would interject a message of hope in here. Fortunately, that is exactly what God does. In chapter 2, verse 12, it shifts from judgment over to hope. And God is the one to provide the hope. And God says in Micah 2:12, "Someday, O Israel, I will gather you. The Lord himself will guide you." What a word of hope. What a word of promise, don't you think? Don't you think people in Micah's day, especially Micah himself, and as one who was a pronouncer of judgment, would also need to have that message of hope? But what about us? God hasn't changed. He's just as righteous and cares for the poor now as much as he did back then. And God will judge or bless us based on how we treat the poor. God really spoke to me in that time, sitting on those steps in Jerusalem. And he has expanded my teaching ministry from Singapore to 12 other nations, which are primarily poor nations, or at least I go to the poor among those nations, or certainly not among the wealthiest among those nations, because that's not my calling. And God's done this good work in my heart so that I would have that privilege of being able to help others. What the Lord's actually telling us is get others out of their bind. You know, one of the ways he's done that through one of the persons in my congregation in Singapore is through soccer ministry. One of my men is involved in soccer, and you know, people always talk about their favorite team, so he has his favorite team. A favorite team of girls. Girls that he goes and supports and ministers to in his annual trips to Cambodia. They provide education, medical care, nutritious food, school uniforms, incentives to the family, community service. And these are great ways that he, in his ability, he's far better at soccer than I am, that he helps integrate these girls into Cambodian society, starting with soccer and through using this means of football to enable these girls to get an education. My friend Dees is far taller than them, but he has other advantages because he has money that they don't have, and he ministers to them in a way that's really quite encouraging to me. So back to me, okay? The point here is to get others out of their bind. Use the skill that you have. Use what's in your hand to be able to help people who are less fortunate than you are. Micah was a prophet. He had the opportunity and the privilege to preach to God's people and the courage to do it. Most of us are not preachers like that. Most of us are not ones who do foretell the future because God hasn't given us a particular message to do that. But Micah has one of the highest foretelling proportions of the prophetic books. 70% of what he says is actually talking about the future. And that itself is a great encouragement to people to recognize that God will truly reward those who help the poor. Micah predicts, as we've already seen, the falls of both Samaria and Jerusalem. Micah also talks about future restoration through a remnant that would lead into the Messianic age. And God has used Micah to be his instrument in this way. You know, there are various tips and problems in terms of interpreting prophecy. Maybe now is a good time to explain a little bit about that. A lot of times we have inaccurate presuppositions. And Micah is one of those books that can be misinterpreted in that regard. For example, we often think that the prophecies are actually only talking about the future. But the prophets were mainly covenant enforcers based on the Mosaic Law. They had an ethical or a forth-telling dimension where they were telling people to look back at the Mosaic Law. Look at the ethics of your life. Are you measuring up to the ethics of what God said that Israel should do? But there's also that predictive element. And there's a foretelling element to the prophets as well. And here the prophets are actually looking at the Mosaic covenant. I touched on this a bit when we talked about Amos. But it's a good thing to remember that we're actually looking both directions. The prophetic message was a message of courage. They were not pushovers. They went against the tide to preach the word of Yahweh or the Lord to a rebellious nation. And they often went right to the king himself, which would have taken an enormous amount of courage. Imagine for yourself, if God put on your heart and put in your mouth words to say to the highest governing official of your country, the king, the prime minister, the president, how much courage would you have to go talk to that person? That's what these prophets did. And a major concern of theirs was idolatry. They were concerned about the fact that Israel continually worshipped the wrong God or gods. And they told the people that. Micah was a very, very courageous man to do that. But they also had social and economic concerns. And they spoke it as it needed to be spoken. They spoke of pronouncements, of judgments to steer the nation away from the curses. Remember the curses? The blessings of Deuteronomy 28 comprise 14 verses. The curses went from verse 15 all the way to verse 68. A lot of curses. A lot of judgment. And the prophets were courageous men to be willing to tell the people about these types of difficult things that most of us don't want to talk about. So Micah's 3 sermons begin with the first sermon, God will reward generosity. That's a great reason for us to be generous. God says to be generous. In the second message that also begins with the word listen, chapter 3, God comforts the generous. He wants the people to realize most of the people are not being generous. Most of the people are exploiting the poor. But if you stand against that, if you are generous, God's going to be generous to you through his comfort. God's going to have compassion and care for you in a unique way when you care for people who are less fortunate than you. I mean, the Lord does that in our lives in a, frankly, a wonderful way. So we see as we get into chapter 3 that was also really a courageous message that Micah had to preach. The fact that God would comfort those involved in generosity. So we see him starting off in chapter 3 with another message of judgment. It's a message where he talks about how the people need to know justice. Listen, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel, should you not know justice? You who hate good and love evil, who tear the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones. Talks about flesh. Flesh really being decimated because of exploitation. When I think of that, I think of this picture of the hand of a missionary holding the hand of a person who was actually still living in Africa, whose body was ravaged from famine, ravaged from exploitation by the wealthy people, so that this starving boy did not have the food that he needed in order for him to live. Well, Micah championed the poor and the oppressed. And that was his major concern. And you see the social injustice sins here, similar to what we see in Amos. Sins like oppression, bribery, exploitation of the powerless, covetousness, cheating, violence, pride. The common element that they all have is that those that are in power do not use the power for themselves. For others, they use the power only for themselves rather than using that power to really benefit other people. It's a sad reality of our day, even as it is a sad reality. It was a sad reality of Micah's day. And Micah lamented that as well. He also struggled with what he saw in the society here. Jeremiah, actually, interestingly, 100 years after Micah, would refer back to what Micah said in his prophecy, Jeremiah 26. We see Jeremiah saying, Micah of Moresheth prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah. He told the people of Judah, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, and the temple will be a mound overgrown with thickets. Jeremiah said that when it actually did happen. And he said, a century ago, Micah told us that this was going to happen. But we get the opportunity to read it in Micah's book ourselves. It could be a despairing message, but when we get to chapter 4, Micah's message is one of hope. God's message as a message of hope to Micah. And we see in this message here about God talking about the last days, a message where the Messiah is going to come. We actually have in the book of Micah an acronym, you might say. Barry Huddleston in the Acrostic Summarized Bible provides many of these acronyms for us. They're quite interesting because he always has an acronym for every one of the books of the Bible that relates to the theme of that book. And the Messiah is quite prominent in Micah. And so Messiah becomes the acronym for the 7-chapter book. And each one of the chapters are double, the M of the word Messiah doubles as messages against Samaria, Jerusalem. In other words, we have an acrostic here, and then that first chapter is actually summarized in 4 words. The second chapter is summarized in 4 words as well. Evils of Israel's people, etc., as you go on through the book. It's a very effective way, a very helpful way to learn a book, because we see the major emphasis and we see how each book actually contributes to that. I highly recommend it. It is actually out of print right now, unless it comes back in print, but think about that. We will see Isaiah in our next section, next session, but we actually find exact parallels between Micah and Isaiah. As I noted earlier, they're living in the same area of Judah at the same time. They both were very, very prominent in their depiction of the Messiah, and they had in common writing from Jerusalem and writing both about Israel and Judah. And we find that they actually influenced the king to be a righteous king. Both of them stressed the kingdom, and they did so at the same time, so they were contemporaneous. And it's helpful to kind of pair both Micah and Isaiah together. So in our next session, we will be addressing Isaiah to see what he says. But I find it interesting that both of them talk about millennial Jerusalem. In Isaiah, it says, the law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Isaiah says Israel will have this prominent position throughout the world, so that people will learn about the Lord going out from Jerusalem all over the world. Now look and see what Micah says. That's Isaiah 2:3. Now we go to Micah 4:2, and he says, for the law, or for out of Zion shall go forth the law. Does that sound familiar? For the law will go out of Zion, Isaiah says. Micah says, for out of Zion shall go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. We actually have very, very similar writings here, comparing Isaiah 2 and Micah 4. In the latter days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be raised and established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. Micah says exactly the same thing, except he says, and the peoples shall flow to it. It shall be lifted up. Isaiah says that and many peoples will come and say, whereas Micah says many nations will come and say, come, let's go to the house of the Lord, the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, the word of the Lord, from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations. Micah says he shall judge between many peoples. Very similar concept. And decide disputes for many peoples, nations, as Micah says. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Both of these brothers, Isaiah and Micah together, were in this message. You really can't tell who copied from whom, or if God gave separate messages exactly, or just tweaked slightly to each of them. They have had an impact, though. They've had an impact on the world wanting to see this actually happen. In the United Nations building in New York City, we find this very prominent statue of a man with a hammer beating a plow. And he's actually beating a sword. And he's beating a sword into a plow. And right on the wall there is the quote from Isaiah. They shall beat them. A place here in our world presently with a lion, a tiger, and a bear who are carnivorous animals that many believe they must kill meat and they must eat meat, but they're living in a peaceful environment. Balu the bear, Leo the lion, and Shere Khan the tiger are known together as BLT. They live in a zoo. They're animals that were originally owned by a drug dealer who didn't properly care for them, and that led to poor health and neglect and severe injuries. Quite traumatized, actually, when they were taken to Locust Grove, Georgia, where they were treated for their injuries. And they were small, and they grew up together. And they became kind of like a family. So the zoo decided to keep them together. Rather than putting these animals that normally would kill one another in separate cages, they keep them together. The former owner had put a harness on Balu, the bear, but he had it surgically removed, and they have been good buddies. The trio has found comfort in one another during their years of mistreatment. And so they're fenced in, but they're all fenced in together. And they are really a reminder to us that animals, even animals who kill to eat, can truly be reformed. It's happening right now, and certainly it can happen in the future. We will see this a little more clearly when we get to Isaiah. But Micah is essentially a mini Isaiah. Many of the things that Micah talks about, Isaiah talks about to a greater extent because Isaiah's prophecy is far larger. But he has been called the mini Isaiah. What we do in terms of unique things in Micah, we find Christ in Micah in a way you will not find in any other book. I'm talking about Micah 5, verse 2, which is the only prophecy in the Old Testament that predicts the birthplace of Messiah as Bethlehem. Micah also gives us the best descriptions of the righteous reign of Christ over the whole world. And we can put those together, actually, when we read Micah 5:2. And you, Bethlehem, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel. We know that God worked in a pretty amazing way to journey Joseph and Mary in Matthew 1 and 2 to bring them on down to Bethlehem, because that was where God said Jesus had to be born. But he said that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem, so he would actually rule over an enlarged Israel. And the loss of land from the Jews, from the ancient times, from the ancient Jewish kingdom of David and Solomon was huge. That was even smaller when we come to 1920, and it's even smaller right now. But God's reversing that, and God has a plan in the days ahead. Despite the world rulers that would seek to fight Jerusalem at every end, and it's quite ruthless. God himself standing behind. And he has a plan to fulfill what we find here in Micah as well as in Isaiah. And when we get to Revelation 19, we will see what Micah 5 is actually talking about when the Lord Jesus returns. The remnant left in Israel will take their place among the nations. They will be like a lion among the animals of the forest, like a strong young lion among the flocks of sheep and goats, pouncing and tearing as they go with no rescuer in sight. The people of Israel will stand up to their foes, and all their enemies will be wiped out. Micah 5, 8-9. It's promised of God, and God keeps his promises. And so what we see today with the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem and the Kidron Valley, as we look westward over toward the eastern gate, God's going to do his work. He's going to bring the Messiah through that eastern gate, and Jesus is going to be that one to fulfill these verses in Micah 5. When we get to the third sermon in chapter 6, we see the sermon again begin with the word listen. And we find the third reason why you should be generous, and I should be generous. And that is, God gives hope to the generous. There's a sense of hope that we have when we are willing to part with our money to those who are less fortunate, and God just gives this expectancy as we look to the days ahead. We see this in chapter 6. It begins again with the judgment. It's a courtroom drama, if you will, similar to what we saw back in Hosea 4. Micah 6, 1-8 represents God indicting his people for a breach of covenant. And this is presented for the primary witnesses, who are the mountains, and reminds them of the saving acts of Yahweh. So basically, it's sort of like a day in court, if you will. And the Lord called the Son as his key witness to God fulfilling his covenant to his people. It's an amazing thing. Stand up, chapter 6, verse 1 says. This is what the Lord says. Plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, O mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a case against his people. He's lodging a charge against Israel. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, and also Aaron and Miriam. And God goes on and on. And he says, look at all these things I have done for you. It causes Micah to want to respond to what God is saying. And in his response, in verses 6-8, he begins, what shall I come for with what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Do you think that's what God really wants? Does he want sacrifices? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? With 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer the firstborn for my transgression? The fruit of my body? Do you think God would be happy with a child sacrifice? That would be a great sacrifice of mine. The fruit of my body for the sin of my own soul? Do you think God would be pleased with that? Do you think what God really wants is sacrifices from us? He gives really the key verse in the book. to answer that. Micah asks the question and then he answers the question. He has shown you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. There you go. Justice, mercy, humility. That's what God truly wants. Most of the depictions of the book of Micah, if you look at quotes from the book of Micah, you'll find that Micah really talks quite a bit about destruction. And then he has this one verse that tells us about justice and mercy and humility. But most people, when they teach Micah, they just focus on that one verse. And they don't see it in the context of all that Micah says about judgment. But that's what he says. He has shown you. He's shown you what we really already know. God tells us what we already know. But what he really wants is not our things. He wants us. And he wants us to treat people without any exploitation. He wants us to treat people for their benefit, not for our benefit. And the book finally ends with a look at this exploitation again before we get into chapter 7. Micah sort of answers his own question again, or the Lord speaks through him. What shall I say about the homes of the wicked filled with treasures gained by cheating? What about the disgusting practice of measuring out grain with dishonest measures? How can I tolerate your merchants who use dishonest scales and weights? The rich among you have become wealthy through extortion and violence, and your citizens are so used to lying that their tongues can no longer tell the truth. God is quite tired of exploitation. And you think he was tired 2,700 years ago when this was written? How much more so is he tired of it today? Micah, when he gets to his response to this exploitation, in chapter 7, he says, how miserable I am. I feel like a fruit picker after the harvest who can find nothing to eat. Not a cluster of grapes or a single early fig can be found to satisfy my hunger. The godly people have all disappeared. Not one honest person is left on their earth. They're all murderers, setting traps even for their own brothers. Both their hands are equally skilled at doing evil. Officials and judges alike demand bribes. The people with influence get what they want together. They scheme to twist justice. Even the best of them is like a briar. The most honest is as dangerous as a hedge of thorns. But your judgment day is coming swiftly now. Your time of punishment is here, a time of confusion. Don't trust anyone, not your best friend or even your wife. For the son despises his father. The daughter defies her mother. The daughter-in-law defies her mother-in-law. Your enemies are right in your own household. That is an extreme level of exploitation, is it not? But thank God, the book ends with a message of hope. And the first two messages of hope in this pattern of judgment, hope, judgment, hope, judgment, hope, the third time. The first two were messages of hope from God, delivered by God. This one is a message delivered from the perspective of Micah. As for me, I look to the Lord for help. I wait confidently for God to save me, and my God will certainly hear me. Remember those borders where God said that the descendants of Abraham back in Genesis 15:18 would have the borders from the Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates River? and that God would grant them all that land? Well, we see that it's going to happen. Isaiah said it's going to happen. Micah said it's going to happen earlier in the book. And now we see in chapter 7, in that day, Israel, your cities will be rebuilt and your borders will be extended. People from many lands will come to honor you. From Assyria all the way to the towns of Egypt. And from Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River and from the distant seas and mountains. Wow. There's going to be quite a regathering in Israel when God brings Israel to the place that he's always wanted, for this place where he placed his name. Where is another God like you, who pardons the guilt of the remnant, overlooking the sins of his special people? You will not stay angry with your people forever, because you delight in showing unfailing love. Once again, you will have compassion on us. You will trample our sins under your feet and throw them into the depths of the ocean. You will show us your faithfulness and unfailing love, as you promised to our ancestors, Abraham and Jacob, long ago. So why does God want us to be generous to the poor? The central thought, I believe, in this book is simply this: be generous to others, and God will be generous to you. God wants us to be generous people. And we see God will reward you when you're generous. We have seen in the second message, God comforts the generous. And we've seen in the third message of Micah, God gives hope to the generous. So it really leaves us with this question: how can you better learn to live with less money? How can you better help those with less money than you by giving some of your money to them? It's a good message for us to really consider. It's a good message for us to ask how we can truly help people. I read the story of a 99-year-old man who begs every day. And whatever money he gets from begging, he gives it all away to orphans and churches. Interesting. Wow. God's telling us, don't harden your heart. Be generous. Feed the hungry. Give. Care. Listen. I pray that you will.